of 17 gang raped at a party. And every time she saw a beer ad like the one we had discussed, or a print campaign for Guess Jeans where there was this implied violence which was seen as a natural part of sexual relationships between men and women, she relived the gang rape. And so she could never speak publicly, but she so appreciated seeing someone else in public make those connections. And so I think that because women's voices are still so underrepresented, every time we speak our truth, some aspect of what we know to be important, it has the capacity to make incredible change or ripples or awareness or connections for other people. And here was my other piece of proof. I contacted CBC and I said, can you give me the email address of the advertising executive who had been on television with me defending the campaign? And with Jennifer's permission, I removed her identifying information and I forwarded it to him, her email. And to his credit, he responded and he said, essentially, oh my God, I'm the father of a 2-year-old daughter and I had never made the connection that has just been made for me. And I will, as an advertiser, as a contemporary Mad Men, never create a sexually objectifying advertisement again.
Wow.
So.
Did you track him?
No, and I don't remember his name either.
It's incredibly...
But his daughter's probably 12 now.
Wow.
So he's probably even more concerned about her safety.
Yeah.
Exactly. I'd like to just speak a bit about a quote from Charlotte in her latest book, The Massey Murder, which came out in 2013. And in that work, and most of the work that you do, you talk, as a historian, as a writer, you focus on your attention on forgotten lives, which you alluded to a bit earlier. And you note in your introduction to the Massey murder that you're interested in the long-dead individuals who left no record behind them. What happens to anonymous, powerless individuals who are swept up by events and currents completely beyond their control? And I'm wondering if you could just sort of expand on that a bit and talk about your work as a historian and how you have brought these stories of forgotten women to the fore, because your work is very powerful in that respect. And for the rest, for Lorna and Sherry, I'm also wondering if you could also comment on how your work has given voices to those forgotten lives, for, you know, to use Charlotte's term, to the larger project of a more inclusive public discourse.
The reason I started writing about women in Canadian history was that coming from and having been educated in history in Britain, where there's a very solid, rich tradition of social history and biography. I mean, you can't go into a British bookshop without seeing reams of biographies of women. I'll admit that they all seem to be about characters who are straight out of Downton Abbey. You know, that it's the sort of sister of the Duchess of Devonshire and the mother and everything. But nonetheless, you know, that it's a recognized genre. When I came to Canada, so this is pre-Downton Abbey days, I was amazed at how little social history there was. And so, for a variety of reasons, I started writing biographies of women, which are a wonderful way to write about social history. Because when we're talking about social history, what are we talking about? We're talking about the sinews of community. We're talking about the people who have knit together their villages, their communities, their small towns, their cities. And so I started writing about women. But I was constrained by what's your raw material? Unlike political history, you know, there's no sort of statutes and newspaper, not much newspaper coverage. So I was constrained by what sources were available, which is always the diaries and letters. And increasingly I realized that I was so lucky to find my first 3 books were about women who had left good sources that I could work with when I did biographies. And I kept thinking of all those I mean, I kept thinking of those women's servants, and I kept thinking of all the people who have completely disappeared. And I was emboldened by now, because I realized what an appetite there is in this country to hear about people who were not men in suits or uniforms. That, in fact, most of us, male and female, do not fit into that category. And that I really wanted to bring more depth to the Canadian past so more of us could relate to it. Because an immigrant story is an immigrant story, whether it's 1915 or 2015. Changing countries is a traumatic experience, even if you're not running away from something. And everybody can relate to that story if we can just find the information in the past. And so that's what I did with the Massey murder, because this particular poor young immigrant, Carrie Davis, she swam to the top of the public consciousness of her time because she just happened to shoot her employer, and that'll get you in the newspapers, and then there's a trial. But I find that is what the stories of ordinary people, if they're told in a particular, if you can tell them in a way that engages others, will illuminate so much about the past and the present. And we've had far too much history in this country, which is just laws and wars, maps and chaps. We're dominated by political history. There were other people besides those who got elected. And that's what I've always tried to do.
Hear, hear.
I have to say how grateful I am to the historians of this country, because from my own field, there's almost nothing that you can do without reading the history, and so I can only urge you to keep it up. But my own interest has been in more in both demographic data, you know, the mortality causes and so on, all of which is really interesting, and breaking down those demographic data. For example, the accepted wisdom about the high fertility rates in Quebec, which were matched by the high fertility rates in Prince Edward County, I have to say, at that time.
That's interesting.
And if you break it down by parishes, and there's loads of, we have wonderful demographic data from the early days. Of course, now it's much less. But there are marvelous people working on that, all of which I think is very useful to understanding women's lives, and which I have written about in a book a couple of years ago, and women's organizations. Because whatever comes out publicly is usually done by a whole lot of women giving whatever time they have available to making things happen to whatever organizations are important to them. So in the conversation earlier about Twitter, I said to Mary, who I was sitting beside, we used to have telephone trees. And we did. We had very elaborate telephone trees. And when the minister of whatever in Ontario said that, women who had children and all the obligations would find the 20 minutes to call and fuss. And that, I think, is an incredibly interesting period of our history that also deserves more documentation.
Absolutely.
So I'm really grateful for academics, for scholars. I did a master's degree and realized I wasn't cut out for academia. And now what I do is I work with women who are really expert in their field. I have very narrow and very shallow expertise related to the portrayal and representation of women in the media. But I get to work now with brilliant scholars from across the country who know vast reams of stuff about demographics or history or all other manner of things. And so what I do is support them in translating what they know into accessible, short-form, engaging commentary through the media, through op-eds or media interviews, so that their analysis and their interpretation and their perspectives and their knowledge gets shared more broadly. And it is the most satisfying work I have ever done, and it's far more gratifying than seeing my own byline in a newspaper, knowing that, we're giving birth to thousands more public intellectuals. whatever they call themselves.
And certainly that idea, I think, of translation of knowledge, and you, all three of you do that obviously, and you do that in different ways, as have all the other panelists and a lot of the attendees here. So I mean, that's another current interesting theme that has sort of run throughout this conference, and I think will run tomorrow as well. I would like to turn the table over to you, the audience. And if any of you have any questions for our panelists or comments, we would certainly welcome them right now. Hi.
Can you hear me? I wanted to pick up with a second question that Megan posed for the panel. I think it was the second question. It was quite a few minutes ago anyway. And it stems from my work in women's shelters and women living in compromised domestic situations today in Canada. And your question was to the panel, let's talk about issues facing Canadian women today. And so here's my question. Domestic violence and the barriers to women who have lived through domestic violence. How could public policy be written now, 2014 and moving forward, to improve the circumstances of these women, where instead of their social mobility plummeting and their economic viability diminishing, how could these women have more social mobility, be as economically viable in the Canadian fabric as they were prior to domestic violence? How can this very real issue for many Canadian women today, right now, cuts across all socioeconomic strata, all ethnicities, all races, how could this be addressed outside of women's shelters that are in place in many of our Canadian communities and cities? How could this be addressed outside of collaborative venues and safe communities, safe places for women? How can policy address and enable women of domestic abuse to be viable persons in Canadian society again? I'd really like to know some of
Just off the tops of our heads.
Just off the tops of your heads. Just wing it. I'd like to tap into that, because when Megan came out with that, what are some of those issues facing Canadian women today? And right away, with my background in shelters and activism for women, proactive, this just came to mind, and I really wanted to, I thought this was the perfect venue for this to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you.
So you might actually have a good sociological response, but I'm going to respond briefly by saying that more women speaking up in the media more generally, I believe, is one of the ways that we start getting at intractable social, economic, environmental problems. And the proof that I have for that, since I launched Informed Opinions 4 years ago, we've been trying to measure the absence of women's voice. And so I can measure it by saying only 25% of the experts are women, but what difference does that make to our conversations? So we took the first 100 op-eds that women we trained had published in daily newspapers or online sites, and we created a word cloud. This is the word cloud. There are postcards I realize you can't actually get to the stage, so I'm happy to share them. So we created this word cloud that was a composite of the issues that came up most often in op-eds that were written by women scientists, economists, historians, sociologists, lawyers across the country. So we knew what women talked about, but we didn't know what the difference was with men. So then we took a random sample of 100 op-eds from the same newspapers at the same time, written by men, and we created another word cloud, and then we compared the two to see which words were only in the women-written op-eds. Let me just read them to you. They're so to your point. Abuse, access, assault, benefit, care, children, cuts, discrimination, education, equality, families, future, girls, help, justice, national need, people, policy, research, response, services, sexual, society, story, strategy, students, support, treatment, violence, women. When women's voices are absent, those are among the issues that we are not talking enough about. I don't have the solution for how we actually change those intractable problems, but maybe.
They are extremely difficult and complicated problems, but I would argue that if we had pay equity, so a woman could feel confident leaving a household and being able to look after her responsibilities with her children because she was being paid properly and she had a pension at the end of that, and etc., that the world would be a better place. And the gap between those people with a lot of and increasing money and everybody else is a serious, serious problem which only exacerbates the problems that we were just hearing about. And it seems to me that those can be addressed in public policy and that things can be done about those issues. We have a problem that you will probably both know more about, which is how do you make the voter conscious of that? To get to the point where you can you always have to have coalitions, so you have to form coalitions across the House or wherever it is to get to some resolution of those issues.
I mean, you're really talking about income stability and a whole raft of social programs, and you're not going to get them with this government.
Well, that's what I mean, yeah.
And so, in fact, what you have to do is bring those, exactly as Sherry says, those issues into public discourse, however you're going to do it, and elect governments that are committed to, that believe that government has a role in producing public good. We don't have that right now federally.
Not federally, but we have some very good provincial
We
governments.
have very good provincial governments.
And many of the issues are in their domain.
But if they don't have any money.
Well, but enforcing pay equity is a matter of enforcement.
Yeah.
And
No,
provincially,
yes,
insofar as there are provincial laws in employment, it can be done and should be encouraged.
Yeah.
Our provincial government should be encouraged to do better enforcement than they. I mean, I don't think the problem is going to be solved right away, but I do think that there are things that can be done and that need to be done urgently in this regard. It must be. Shelters must be more crowded than they were. Things must be worse than they were because of the kind of contingent labor and the other issues that.
And we're certainly talking about a larger framework of neoliberalism and what's happened to the social safety net over the last couple of decades as well. Do we have some more questions over there? Yeah.
And we need the data, just to the point Laura made earlier.
Data would be a really good idea.
We need the data to be able to authoritatively comment on the situation and the status quo, and that also is a real problem.
Hi. This can be in general, but Ms. Gray touched on it. It's easy to understand why one would be uncomfortable to appear on television without makeup. That being said, for as much as you work towards ending females being objectified, do you see yourself at any time consciously aligning yourself with this principle by refusing makeup?
Actually, I'm sorry.
I can't hear you. Down and speak into the mic.
Sorry.
Just move the mic down a bit.
And slow down.
Okay. Okay, so I was saying this can be a general question, but Ms. Gray touched on it. It's easy to understand why one would be uncomfortable not wearing, like appearing on television, not wearing any makeup. That being said, for as much as you work towards ending females being objectified, do you see yourself at any time consciously aligning yourself with this principle by refusing makeup for a television appearance?
Would I refuse to wear makeup on television? No, because I wear makeup. I'm wearing it now, here. I wear makeup. You
At
know,
a feminist conference?
at a feminist conference, I'm wearing makeup. Kill me. But that's just one issue in a whole range of things. For instance, for a long time, when I was writing magazine articles about politics, I was doing political commentary on regular weekly panels. And I know that one of the reasons I was there was because they had 2 men and they needed a woman. And I mean, we've all been in that situation. And every time I thought, I feel like a token, I'd then look at the 2 men. And part of it was that they did have this wonderful sort of male gene of, my opinions are really good. They're really, everybody wants to know them. But they were also fighting for their place on television. That it's not sort of, it's a competitive world out there, and you use what you can within the bounds of your ethical standards.
I've never gone on television with no makeup, although my mother would suggest otherwise. But I have been on a show where I said to the woman interviewing me backstage before we got given our makeup, how about we both go on with no makeup? Because I thought that would be cool, and I thought she might be up for it, and she wasn't, and so I didn't either. But I do feel the older I become, and if I continue to be given opportunities to go on television, I get, paradoxically, both more concerned with how I fail to live up to the dominant ideals of femininity and less attached to doing so because there's actually no hope. And so I imagine that, maybe in my 75th or 80th year, I will be delighted to go on television resplendent in my wrinkles and have no makeup.
I love radio.
I look great on radio, yeah.
Thank you. I think we have a question over here.
Yeah, thank you. I just came from a conference that was alluded to in the last session in Prince Edward Island, which is marking the 150th anniversary of the Charlottetown Conference from 1864. And Kim Campbell came up with a bold vision, which was the name of the conference, which I believe I could attribute to Judy Rebick from about 20 years back from another conference when we were talking about the Constitution. And I'm just wondering, since we've got a powerful panel up here, how we could maybe mobilize the conversation, because I think it could just fall under the radar. The idea is that we have 2-member constituencies, which I'm told PEI had for 113 years or something. It's not a new idea. The issue of that day was how to represent Catholics and Protestants, so you might be able to refer back to the Pope or whatever. But how can we have that conversation? How can you mobilize those 100 people who can write op-eds or whatever so that this becomes an issue for the 2015 election? We're not going to change it then, but that it's discussed then and that people we elect then will deal with electoral reform in a very pragmatic way very quickly.
Thank you.
If we were to deputize or recruit a woman in every market, every media market, large and small across the country, who understood that proposal and the potential significant impact that it could make on all of our public conversations, not to mention policy and spending priorities, and deputize those women to, some of them could be men, who would on a regular basis write op-eds or engage in the public discourse and promote the idea, it could happen. The fact, who was it who told the story?
Laurie Turnbull.
So Laurie Turnbull told the story and said that on the radio call-in show, half were opposed and half were for, but most of the callers were men, which is almost always the case. Whenever I've been on private radio, almost all the callers are men. And so, women are too busy actually picking up their children, doing their job, to be sitting listening to daytime radio. But this is another argument for why women need to be more engaged, need to speak up, need to express our priorities and concerns and demand the kind of equality that will serve not just us, but in fact the entire country.
There's far too much optimism at this conference. Wendy, It would be great, but I don't think it's going to happen. Diane was talking in her talk up here about going to an evening and hearing lots of young people talking about great ideas about social justice. But in other rooms at the same time, there is the right-wing, reactionary young people talking about how to lower taxes and get government off our backs. And so I don't think that simply getting women is going to be enough. I want the right kind of women who think the right way about these things.
But yeah, so I agree with that. We need progressive-minded men, absolutely, to be on this program. But the fact that 2/3 of Canadians have not elected the current government, do not support the current government. I mean, now we're going to get into an area that is not my specialty, but
you're doing well, go on.
okay, so I'm in the optimistic camp, and what makes me pessimistic is the fact that the progressive parties are likely once again to split the vote, and against all odds, the Conservatives could once again get re-elected. So I don't know how you solve that, but I don't feel like just because in another room there are conservative-minded non-progressives at the same conference doesn't mean that the majority of Canadians do not, in fact, support the kinds of issues that we're talking about or that we need.
Actually, one of the things I find most offensive about public opinion polls at the moment, women voters always are more likely, it's a larger percentage of women vote for the parties on the left than the parties on the right. The gap right now is huge. The women are not lining up to re-elect Mr. Harper. Repeatedly, we hear it's because they're in love with Justin Trudeau's hair. It is so annoying. I mean, it's a perfectly rational decision for a woman to endorse a government or a party that is going to make their lives easier, with whether it's the NDP and daycare or more income supports or whatever it is. It's rational to vote for the women to vote for the left-wing parties. But if I read one more observation on Justin Trudeau's hair, I'm going to throw up.
That'll really help.
I'm a writer. I'm not a politician. But I mean, it just seems so ridiculous that I don't.
It's deeply insulting.
It's so insulting. Why? I don't understand why women are voting against their own self-interest if they vote for a right-wing party. It's even worse in the U.S.
Oh, yeah.
On the other hand, the U.S. Elected Barack Obama, and women were pivotal to both of his elections. And so if we speak up and organize and mobilize, who knows what can happen.
Mm-hmm. Hi there, thanks for all that. My name is Mia. I'm the Executive Director of the YWCA Halifax. And the reason I share that is because it puts me in the media. So both as a YW, we'll proactively put our stamp or express an opinion on something that's happening, but we also get sought. So people will come to us and ask, what do we think about something? And something that as I've been listening to you, I've been really wrestling, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is this past week, and I was sharing with a colleague here, someone who I know in our community had approached me. She wants to pitch me as an amazing woman for Canadian Living magazine. I said, oh, well, that's great, but don't do me. And part of it, but this is part of it. When you talked about your accent privileges you, my whiteness privileges me, my ability privileges me, my class privileges me. And my response to her was, listen, we work with hundreds of women who are far more amazing than I am, because they live in poverty and they raise their children with dignity. Because when we talk about public spaces, they encounter public buses every single day with 3 children in tow and strollers. So for me, when you do the word cloud, I think about
mental health, was that there? Addiction, was that there? So all of those things that are affecting women, disability, who are even further marginalized. And so for me, it is actually quite easy for me to be in the media. I'm educated, I've, well-versed on the subjects, issues, whatever. I actually don't have any problem. But I wonder also when we talk about women in the media, which women and which women's voices are privileged. And we've been talking a lot about academia here. I live next door to what I found out is an addiction specialist. I've never heard of his work, and I work with women with addictions every single day. He's known throughout the province for his cutting-edge research on addictions. It has no bearing on the women who are doing sex for drugs. So for me, I just feel like when do those women's voices get put in, and when do we step out of it? So when do we make sure that their voices are supported? And when you talked about the op-ed training, for me, it's not just around here, go and talk, it's also around training and support for those women to be able to share their voices, because they will put in words in the word cloud that I don't bring up.
Absolutely. What you said is so important and so powerful. And one of the reasons that Informed Opinion specifically focuses on teaching op-ed writing is because if you're not already known by the media, and if you don't have a PhD and you don't have a tenured position at a university, and so you're not as likely to be called, writing an op-ed is a way to engage in the public discourse with relatively little risk. I mean, you might get hate mail, but you get to frame the issue in your words. You get to share your perspective, your experience-informed views, and it's a way to announce to the world, I know something about this, and this that I know about is important, and it should be part of our collective dialogue. And so, yeah, I salute you for, look, so they said either we do you or we do nobody. Okay, so in that case,
Do it.
I would do it. I mean, I think the impetus to attempt to broaden the circle and engage and profile other women and men for that matter, for people who are more marginalized is critically important, but better to have coverage of you who even raises those issues than of, I don't know, the car dealer down the street who will talk about completely different things. So it's a balancing act. But, one of the things women say to me, well, I would do interviews if I get called, but nobody calls me. Well, nobody was calling me before I wrote my first op-ed either. And some women say, well, I've never written an op-ed because nobody's ever asked me to write an op-ed. Nobody is going to ask you to write an op-ed. And so it's just about looking for opportunities where the voice and the experience and the perspectives you have can add value to people's understanding of issues that you know more about than most people.
Can I just add something to that? I also think that readers get a lot of confidence about accepting views that come from organizations they respect, like the Y and a number of other organizations. And sometimes an individual voice is not nearly as impactful as your name as what you are at the Y. Because you listen to the Y.
And especially an organization like the Y or like a public library. These are not seen, universities are privileged. Mm-hmm. We know that people who work in universities have had a huge amount of education and it's a bubble. Everybody knows that the Y or the public library is open to everybody, so that you come from you are much more accessible yourself, and they also know they're going to be able to understand what you write and what you say, because you're going to use ordinary language.
The other thing I was really struck by, something Mary Ebert said when she was up here earlier, and she was talking about all the years that she has worked with Aboriginal women's organizations, and she has been the technician, I think she referred to herself, and now she was moving to embrace actually having a voice on the issues that she cares about. and knows so much about. And sometimes just it's easier for people to hear a man speak against violence against women than it is to hear a woman who's simply advocating her own special interest. Or it's easier to hear a white person sometimes make the case against racism because by white people who may also, be viewing the situation in the same way that the perpetrators of the racism were. And so sometimes I'm not suggesting here that we should be co-opting diverse voices. We need diverse voices to be speaking to their experience, but sometimes there's an advantage to somebody being in the media who is not of the marginalized, disadvantaged group, because what they say is heard by people who would not hear what the person from the marginalized group says. So I think both are really important.
And we've got a few more minutes left. Time for one more question, I think.
Hi, thank you. I was at a talk recently on women in science, and one of the lecturers had compiled a word cloud as well, but for reference letters for males versus females. And it was incredibly striking. The males the words that were chosen were typically superb or extraordinary, implying this innate ability to exceed expectations, I guess, in the workplace. Whereas for women, it was typically hardworking, conscientious, just things like more maternal kind of words. And I don't know if you guys could perhaps speak on the words we should be using and how to kind of respect that humility and modesty, but still kind of bring females to the same level in the workplace.
I've heard of that research. I think it was really, really powerful. And the fact that we're getting to have conversations where that's acknowledged and where we all know about the way they audition orchestra members behind curtains now so that they don't run up against that bias is critically important.
It works in several ways, though. I am involved with the National Judicial Institute, helping judges write and not use jargon. And there is a course that is given in both the US and in Canada, and it's called I can't remember the whole title, but part of it is Advanced Judgment Writing. And in the States, they had to put the word advanced in, because nobody would apply unless it was advanced. But in Canada, they had to take it out, because nobody would apply, because Canadian judges are so modest. They didn't feel they were advanced. They wanted the basic course. So, I mean, sometimes I think, and I come from, you'd never guess it, but I come from Britain, where one of the things that you grow up deeply embedded in your consciousness is the class system. And so often I feel the women's movement here, in fact, took off much faster in terms of effectiveness. It took off much faster in Canada than in Britain, because in Canada, women were prepared, women from different backgrounds, in different kinds of families, were prepared to build bridges to each other. But in Britain, for a long time, women felt loyalty to their class rather than their gender. So I know what you're talking about when you say women are just innately modest, and it's one of those things where we all just have to learn. We have to learn to promote. I mean, it goes back to what I was saying about, I'm pretty commercial in my elbowing my way onto the public stage, because that's how I'm going to sell books. And I feel still sort of embarrassed at my own pushiness. I'm actually incredibly impressed by young women of my son's generation who don't have any of these kind of hang-ups and who assume a right to be in the public sphere.
Just to clarify, though, that research was not about words women used to describe themselves. It was words used by people recommending them.
Yes, so these were reference letters.
Oh, yes, actually, I did see that research, yeah.
Yes, but I mean, it was a predominantly female audience, and all of us were kind of taken aback because I think most of us here even would think that conscientious and hardworking would be really, really important kind of buzzwords to use in a reference letter, but in fact, they can hold a person back.
But so what you must do is become a professor and sit on a selection committee, because it is one of the most fascinating experiences you can ever have in reading this letter. You know, if they're British letters of reference, they're in about one paragraph. You know, they'll say, so-and-so is a good person. Yours truly, blah, blah, blah. If they're from the United States, they're never less than 3 pages. And it goes on and on. They've got a thesaurus. And in Canada, some were in between, but many years ago, I sat on the Queen Elizabeth II Scholarship Committee. Very rich it was in those days. And one letter of reference, which I managed to get removed from the file, was from a very distinguished professor at a university down the road from the University of Toronto in a city on Old City. And it said, Miss So-and-so was applying for the scholarship, and the letter said, this must have been in the 70s, Miss X is no doubt a wonderful student. I don't know her personally, but she's married to my student. Honestly.
You know, just thinking practically about, because before they get to be on the committee where they're reviewing those applications, they actually have to have the letters written about themselves to get access to the positions or grad school or whatever. So here's what I would suggest. If you're in the position of requesting letters of reference from professors or whoever, that you send them the research that you just cited with your request for the letter.
I'd actually send them a draft of the letter that you'd like them to send.
That's even better.
I mean, I find that I'm often asked for letters, and I actually ask, they don't have to use your draft.
But it's quite helpful.
All right, on that note, I hate to cut off the conversation, but we are at time. So I would like to invite you all to join me in thanking our panelists, Charlotte, Sherry, and Lorna.
And Megan.
And we look forward to continuing the conversation with you tomorrow. Thank you very much.
I have one more quick sales pitch. So informed opinions, because we've come across so many women who say, I'm not the best person. We've created this little greeting card that has a wonderful woman who's saying, oh my God, maybe I am the best person. And I get emails from people across the country who say, when they discover where it came from, I have that in my cubicle, I look at it every day, it's inspirational. These cards can be yours for $2 a piece. Thank you very much.
It's a great card. It's wonderful.